This is my completed high-res mesh. I did wind up doing a Zremesh and projection on this, and I'm going to basically talk about the method I like to use is to kind of stick within ZBrush, but I do want to sort of expand beyond that and show you Substance Painter. So, and I do have separate subtools. I'm not going to deal with separate subtools in this edition or this lecture. I'm going to basically deal with the primary subtool, which in this case is basically the face. So some of you may have modeled this way where you kind of Zremeshed early on and divided up the model and sculpted it, in which case you can go basically export this version and then this version. But I'm going to deal with this as if you had sort of Dynameshed this right away. So I'll show you how to work with that. Now this is my custom interface, of course, and all of this stuff can be found within basically under Geometry. Dynamesh is here, and Zremesher is over here. So for me, typically, I will have Dynameshed up to 1 million plus polygons. So I'm just going to have this Dynamesh. Sometimes if I do Dynamesh things together, like, maybe I would Dynamesh the teeth together. I wouldn't Dynamesh the ring together to this because it's basically potentially going to move or be animated. But I could have, merged the teeth into the head. But yeah, let's say you're starting from a Dynamesh. I'm going to show you how to basically get this to be low res. That's sort of the first step to then getting textures baked out from the high res and output to the low res. So I will typically duplicate my mesh. Also, this mesh is quite heavy, so sometimes what I'll do is I'll just simply drop the resolution slider and control click and drag again. Dynamesh, for whatever reason, if you don't actually touch the mesh, you can't Dynamesh twice in a row, even though you've changed the resolution slider. It's a bit of a weird gap, I would say, in the technology. So usually what I have to do is kind of like just smooth or sculpt something very, very lightly, and then I'll Dynamesh again. And now you see it gets me to 500,000 polys, and I'll just solo this so we can see it. Sometimes there are issues, like you can see there's little glitchy parts if there's tiny gaps and crevices, which again we want to try to avoid. If that happens, I do have another method of kind of simplifying this mesh. Again, I could Zremesh right from 6 million polys, but the chances of this thing basically freezing, crashing are really, really high. I find I try not to Dynamesh anything over, I try not to Zremesh anything over 500,000 polys. I think the highest I've gone is something like 600,000 to 700,000, and it works, but it takes a while. So if Dynamesh doesn't work in this case, where it's kind of creating some weird bleeding between surfaces and crevices, there is a second method which again is very, very useful. I'll go to Z plugin and do what's called a decimate. Decimation master. So you have to pre-process the current subtool. So this will basically analyze the surface for details and shapes, and when I do the second part, which is, so there's a pre-process and then the decimate. The decimate will basically turn this all into triangles. I know I've said, triangles are kind of illegal, we should avoid them, which is true when you're doing things like extruding, beveling, doing polygon modeling. It's ideal to have more quad-based mesh, but there are exceptions to, like most rules, there are exceptions. So sometimes when you have mesh in an environment like rocks or rough terrain and things like that, things that don't move or aren't bending and flexing, you can actually, in a lot of cases, just convert that to raw triangles. And what's kind of great about that is you can keep a lot of surface detail, while also dropping the polygon significantly. So I'll show you what I mean in a second when this thing completes. It's almost done processing. So the pre-processing is done, and now you can decimate. What's kind of great about this is you can kind of click different numbers. So there's like a percentage slider. For me, I know like under 500,000 polys is good. For whatever reason, a lot of things are set as points, like vertex points, okay? And typically what I've seen is like 250,000 vertex points is equal to roughly double that number in polygons. So if I hit 250K, that's a preset, or if you hit the slider and then hit decimate current, it will basically drop the poly count. Now, what's kind of cool about this, like I said, is that it's 500,000 polys, but it virtually doesn't look that different, It looks almost identical. But if you take a look, right, the surface just becomes all triangles. Again, this is just an intermediate step because I can't just remesh a 6 million poly mesh. Even a 1 to 2 million poly mesh, if that's where your model's at, it's going to be tough. So Again, I duplicated this just to make sure you're sort of seeing what's happening. I've duplicated this, so I have my high poly basically up here, my low poly down here. So now my next step is going to be to Zremesh. Sometimes I find you can basically try to go right to your ideal poly count. So I can maybe just try to go right to 10,000. I'll set the number usually a little bit below because it's not entirely accurate. And if adapt is on, this may also increase the poly count much higher because adapt is going to say, hey, let's keep mesh where there are details. Let's force it to be higher poly if need be, okay? I don't have any groups right now, so sometimes I'll just try just a raw one-click Zremesh. Again, it's got a process. So yeah, you can multiply this, you know, if this were 2 million polys, it would take up to 4 times longer because it would be 4 times the poly count to Zremesh. You know, sometimes you get lucky and the first approach is pretty good. I'm not entirely enthused by the edges and stuff here, so I'm going to undo. I typically will use polygroups because the second advantage of using polygroups is that I can turn those polygroups into UVs as well. So what's kind of handy is that a lot of times you want a split in the UVs where there are sort of creases and deep edges and a big change in the surface. So this is kind of a big, broad, relatively flat area like the cheeks, and the same thing with the ears, but there is a bit of an angle change there. So a lot of times what I'll do is basically use masking or visibility. So I'll come in with the control, click, and drag. I will just make sure I do this in symmetry, by the way. So I'll sort of paint through this selection. Again, make sure I get kind of right up to that sort of crown piece on top. Okay, hit Control W. So what that basically does is split this into a polygroup, okay? I'll do the same thing with these sort of feet. Again, sometimes we can just use something like Select Lasso as well. So you can use either masking or essentially visibility. Okay, so I'll let's try that again. All right, I don't want that little tip of the mustache, so I'm going to basically just hide that off. Yeah, that seems okay. So I'm going to hit, yeah, before I hit Control W, I just want to make sure it's the same on both sides. It looks like there's a little bit of mustache right over there. Or maybe I'll just smooth it out and try to deal with it later. I notice there's another part sitting there, so I'm going to undo and just make sure that's hidden as well. So just want to try to be as precise as possible, basically. Because this will avoid potential remeshing errors. Okay, Control W. Control Shift click on the background to unhide everything. So at this point too, I'll start isolating essentially, and we can also turn off the line function. Sometimes that's a bit distracting as well. So Control Shift click. If you Control Shift click and then hold Alt, that will hide, of course, parts of the mesh. Maybe I'll just try to get in this way here. Okay, and then I'll just nudge that over with spacebar, Control W. So Control Shift click on the face. So I'm really kind of going after big features. There's another kind of interesting tool with this. If you hold Control, click, and drag, sometimes you can get kind of like with the move tool, I should say, move, scale, rotate, or transpose tool, you can kind of get this like directional masking, which can sometimes be useful. So if I Control Alt click on the model, it's going to sharpen the mask. So it can sometimes help me get to, yeah, basically a quick mask for the model. So yeah, maybe I'll just kind of split off this little, this little kind of beard section or whatever, chin beard. Okay, Control W. Okay. All right, and then, yeah, I mean, I could do the mustache. I'm okay with it kind of being part of everything else. I'm going to see how it works out. And then for the backside, too, I also noticed the backside maybe wasn't perfectly flat. So sometimes what we can do is, again, I'm going to just hold Control. And instead of using the lasso, I'll switch back to the pen, partially because if I Control, click, and drag off the model, you see I can kind of get a nice kind of straight mask here. And then what I'll do in a second is... yeah, let's try to grab that. Again, you want to do this with perspective off, just so you're not kind of skewing the mesh. One other thing you can do is hold Control and click and drag from the back. If it's spilling onto the front, which it is in this case, what you can do is while holding Control, which is activating one of the mask brushes, you can hit back face mask. So again, if I do this from the back side here and brush that in, I should avoid now it hitting the front side. It's not always perfect, but it does often help. And I'll do the same thing here. Just kind of make sure I'm brushing in the back side here and okay, hit Control W so that becomes its own polygroup, okay? And then again, if I switch to the Move Scale Rotate, Alt click on the back, Alt and hit the reset to make sure I have a perfectly aligned pivot. I'll flip the mask around by Control clicking off the model, and I will essentially scale this thing flat. So I'm going to pull the pivot back a bit and then scale flat. Oops, I'm not sure if I masked it properly. There we go. So I'll just pull this back a bit and scale flat, okay? Just give it the right depth. So that's kind of one way to just sort of quickly clean up the mesh. By the way, if you notice here, I think there's some spillage or something odd that happened here when I did the masking of this. If you Control click on this with the Move Scale Rotate or the Transpose brush, you can basically have it remask. And then I'm going to essentially paint out the areas that I didn't want added here and hit Control W. And then again, I'll Control Shift click on these other polygroups so I can kind of re-add this to this grouping as well. So again, I'll just hit Control W. Now, for some reason, I think I I lost my ears there, so I'm going to just isolate that again and just quickly redo it. So it's okay. I mean, you can make mistakes and go back and readjust that. Okay. Control W. Yeah, also I want to notice too, sometimes like these other groups, if you take a look here, I think I've scaled this back into here a bit, so I'll try to fix that too. I'll flip the mask around and then hold Control and brush that in, and then hit Control W, so that reassesses, or how do I put this? Yeah, by basically flipping the mask around and then painting it back in and hitting Control W, I'm basically reconnecting that polygroup back together to its base. Okay, so there's our lines. I find the best results, I haven't tested this with this current edition of ZBrush 2025.3, but if I turn on Keep Groups and go in half, I usually keep smooth groups up at 100 if it's something more organic. If it's something less organic and more rigid, like a piece of furniture or something mechanical, human-made, I might turn smoothing groups down or off if I'm remeshing, just to let you know. In this case, it's fairly organic looking. So we Z-remesh in half. I like to do this. I find I still get, I think, better results. The other thing that works with this is that you see sometimes these edges are a bit wobbly and wavy. By using that smooth group option here, smooth groups with Keep Groups on, it will kind of work some of this wobbliness out, I find, and that's sort of helpful too, to help you get kind of cleaner, smoother edges in certain areas. Again, it can do the opposite when it's something that's supposed to be more sharp-edged. So if I'm doing something, like I said, furniture-like or with hard edges, I'll turn smooth groups off, okay? So I'll Z-remesh again. There is an alternative to this too, though. If you do have wobbly edges, you can hit the comma key or access Lightbox. And inside the brush section, there is something. Basically, these are expanded categories of brushes. There's smooth brushes, and there's something called smooth groups, which is literally just meant to smooth between polygroups. So it'll kind of average out curvature and sort of straighten out edges that way. So that can be useful as well, okay? So if you find like you've got a really bad wavy wobbly edge and you don't want to totally change the surface, that smooth groups option will help a fair bit. Just remember to switch back to a regular smooth brush. Okay, so Zremesh again, and you can sort of see every time I go in half, the process gets faster and faster. So now I'm at about 8,000, which for me is totally within range. As you can see, when I go from the 18,000 down again, it really wipes out some detail here. So this is where I might say, okay, let's maybe turn down or turn off smooth groups. And it should try to maintain this shape a lot better now, okay? One additional trick, which you can use as well, is to turn on this thing called the topology brush, Zremesh guides. So if you wanted, certain creases and features to remain and the edges to sort of follow in a certain direction, you can do that here. So now if I hit Zremesh, these edges should flow where these lines were. So that can be useful for sort of directing the new topology. So that's the end of basically remeshing. It's pretty clean, and for me, I usually like to delete edges and polygons, polygons and faces that are not visible. So I would basically Control-Shift-click on this poly face twice and then go to delete hidden. If this is always going to rest against a door or a wall, then I would never need to see it. And in that case, I can basically delete the mesh, and I've saved myself, about 2,000 polys, which is quite good.